Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to Zine Talk with Tom and Jenna Rose. Tonight's event is brought to you by the Right Place at King's University College and by Words Fest London, London's Creative and Literary Arts Festival. My name is Tom Cull, and I am a creative writing professor at King's and at Western, and I'm also the creative writing consultant at the Right Place. My guest tonight is the wonderful Jenna Rose Sands. Jenna Rose, and I'll be introducing her more fully in a second. So tonight's presentation is the first of a two-act Zoom talk and shop. Tonight we are talking zines with Jenna Rose, and then towards the end of the evening, I'm going to be sharing with you all out there a way that you can get published in a very special edition of the Words Fest zine. And then next week, at the same time and place, we are welcoming you all back to share submissions that you have written, submissions of poetry, short fiction, prose, tweets, comics, artwork, anything. And you can workshop those with me and your fellow submission folks. And so that's next week, and there's going to be more information about that as we go on tonight. Josh Lambier, the director of the artistic director of Words, is here with us tonight. You can't see him, but he's here. He's working the chat room, and he'll be sharing links to that zine submission call that I was just talking about, and to register for next week's talk. And I should just say that you don't have to attend any of the talks to submit to the zine. So please, as we go on tonight, post your questions for Jenna Rose. We're gonna go for about an hour. It might spill over a little bit. And if you have questions for Jenna Rose, please put them not in the chat, but in the Q&A. And I'll try to get to those towards the end of the talk. So as a way to begin, I want to ground tonight's talk in the land on which it is taking place. We are coming to you tonight from the lands connected to several treaties, including Treaty 6, London Township, Treaty 7, Sombra Township, Treaty 21, Longwoods, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We're on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapeewak, and the Chinantan peoples. And through this territory and through my place of work at King's and at Western runs the beautiful Dashkanzibi or Antler River. This is a river that connects us to one another, to our history. It connects us to the land and to all the animals and plants that, like us, depend on clean water and air and soil to live and thrive. This river ties us to other communities, to other bodies of water, and to our responsibilities to live in concord and peace while opposing the forces of colonialism that attempt to commodify our relationships and further dispossess Indigenous peoples from the land they continue to protect for us all and for future generations. And finally, I just would also say that the river connects us to the 3 First Nations communities that are situated about 30 kilometers downstream from us: Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. So we send our greetings downstream as we acknowledge that as a city and as an institution and as settlers, we have a lot more work to do to ensure that the water that leaves our city is cleaner for having passed through our care. And I just want to give a shout out to Western's Indigenous Awareness Programming this week. You can go online and on Western's page and check that out. Much of the programming, I understand, has been recorded and will be airing again tomorrow on Radio Western, so do check that out. So tonight we're going to talk a lot more about land and about responsibility and about care and about history, and we're going to talk about zines. I'm thrilled to be joined by Jenna Rose Sands. Jenna Rose is a Cree Anishinaabe multimedia artist, activist, organizer, zine maker, mom, daughter, sister, and an animating force in the London arts community. She's the author of the zine series Introducing Atrocities Against Indigenous Canadians for Dummies, a series born out of emotional exhaustion and her desire to educate non-Indigenous folks, confront anti-Indigenous racism in all its forms, and challenge those in power to make real change. welcome Jenna Rose.
Thanks, Tom. Like I
So
said, you that bio that you made me sound really cool. So thank you for that.
it's because you are very cool, and it's so cool to have you here and to be surrounded with all of your zines. I'm just holding up some of them
Oh, look at
that
that
I've been spending a lot.
collection.
Yes, it's a great collection. I've been spending time with them today, and we will at the end make sure that everyone knows where they can get their hands on these zines. But I wanted to kind of start with the basics. We have a lot of people registered for this talk tonight, and I think some of them will be coming to this talk, new to zines.
Mhm.
So maybe we could just start there, and you could talk to us a little bit about what they are, where they come from, and maybe like how you and zines found each other.
Yeah, so zines is short for magazines or fanzines. They have been around for ages. A lot of its root is in sort of the sci-fi fantasy community who used to write like little publications, self-published publications about the sci-fi stuff that they loved, or books or movies or anything like that. Picked up definitely in the 70s, 80s in the punk scene, when people following musicians, a lot of stuff like there was one for ages called Sniffing Glue that sort of followed the punk scene. And then in the 90s it really came to be with the Riot Girl movement. So zines can be like of any size. This one is very long, and this is actually a reproduction of one of my first zines that I bought. Um, so with the Riot Girl movement, it was everything from feminism to you can make a zine, you can have change. It was connected to different bands, like Bikini Kill was really big. They had a zine themselves, and Bust magazine and Bitch magazine also originated as zines and then became full-fledged, feminist um, magazines that are amazing now and still around. So this one is called Hot Pants, and I picked it up at just like a show, like a music show. I couldn't even tell you where I got it from. Like it could have been the embassy or call the office or something. So there's a lot of when we're younger, going to these shows. The internet wasn't really around, and how did we as like mopey emo dramatic teenagers get our stuff out and connect. So there was a lot of what we would refer to now as perzines, like personal zines, where people were, sort of having these diary-esque journalistic things on the like. I had an old typewriter, and geez, I could really use that very quickly. And we'd cut them out, and people made these like really rough, um, these really rough DIY photocopied 10 times, you know, diary pieces, and you could buy them for like 50 cents or a dollar. And then there was a lot of people that were doing things that were sort of educational and DIY. And so this one is called Hot Pants, and it's do it yourself gynecology. So, yeah. Uh-huh. And
Okay.
and so it was originally written in French, coming out of Montreal. It was made in 1999, and it was a collaboration between a gynecologist and a naturopath. And their whole thing was like, you can reproduce this as much as you want, but you need to like have our information on the back. And this sort of blew my mind open. It was like, it's talking about STDs, infections, about your ovaries, your uterus, like different ways of, like alternatives to mainstream menstrual products, like actually learning your body and like not being like, you know, 5 feet away from all the aspects of your body. And it was just really revolutionary for me. And one thing that I really love about zines is like the accessibility. And so I started collecting them when I was younger. Like I just sort of like devoured them as, little secrets. And I still do that. Like when I get them, I'm like, oh, it's so, it feels really precious.
Were your friends collecting them too? Like, were there a kind of group of people in London that were interested in zines?
I don't know if so much it was collecting as it's just that we had them. It was
Right.
part of growing up. We didn't have social media to exchange things, and people would have, you know, people in bands, they would just write out lyrics and they would put them in a little zine. It was like an arts and craft, how to share like what's on your brain, or what you're, when you break up with your first partner and you're all like, oh, the world's gonna end. I need everyone to feel it. And now you can't post it on social media. So I'm gonna make you read my zine about it. So yeah, I mean, it's the same like with music posters. Like I have some old posters from when people used to, like your pals playing like a show in a church basement, and it's like haggard writing, and there was really DIY then, and Kinko's was around, sitting there for the whole afternoon just like photocopying stuff, and it was so cheap at that point as well. Like you just loaded up a card and you could have any, like you could just pick any paper. It was like a smorgasbord. So a lot of, you know, awesome magazines and publications that we see now um, came out of like zines and just small publications. They started as people having something to say that wasn't particularly mainstream, and went with it.
And not having to kind of go through like self-publishing and DIY, not having to kind
Mhm.
of, be edited or have to submit to some other authority that would tell you to change your voice. You could
Mhm.
just, it was kind of grassroots and you were sharing in that way.
That's one thing that I really love about zines is that, if you pick up a book, you know, not to knock books at all. I mean, love reading. But sometimes and even online, like you have to be really critical, like a really critically thinking about these things, because how many people did these words go through? And
Yeah.
how many people like slanted it this way and then changed it this way? The nice thing about zines is that they're rough and it's just like one person. If someone's going to get angry about what I have to say in my zines, you just got to come to me,
Yeah, I
you
was
know?
thinking that when reading them, like how immediate they feel, and not,
Mhm.
I don't know whether necessarily raw, but like as a poet, a poem probably goes through 20, drafts before it even hits an editor who then is going to change it. And I will say that by the time it's published, it feels like kind of something you still like it, it's still yours, but
Mhm.
it's so far removed from that immediate punch that you get when you just
Yeah.
want to say something, you say it. So
Yeah. And a lot of writing it is just sitting, and I'm probably the most annoying person to be around when I'm writing, because I'm a talk out loud, like headphones. And, I'm talking out loud, but a lot of it is written as if I was just saying it to you. Like I'm pissed off and I'm just saying it. So that's what I like about zines is you can feel that, you can feel that energy. And that's what's beautiful about like self-publishing and small press is there is often a lot more um room to maneuver to have that emotion. It's not so clinical in its wording.
Yeah, and the message isn't kind of massaged in any way. It just
Mhm.
comes from you. And so you're going to read a bit tonight, but before that, like you've talked to me before about zine culture and about going to shows where, you can buy zines and I don't know, I've never gone, but they seem like really almost like festive and fun events. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about like, what is zine, the culture around it.
Like the culture of zines back in the day or now?
Kind of, well, I guess I do want to know how, I mean, yeah, how they've kind of changed, and also like, you've talked about zine fairs, right?
Mhm.
Right, where you go and
Yeah.
there's just tons and tons of zines and you walk around and you're just kind of like a kid in a candy shop,
Yeah.
so much stuff. Yeah.
Well, back in the day, a lot of it was at shows, like merch tables, Um, you know, thank thank the people in the world that did so much watching merch tables like during during younger days. A lot of it, yeah, it was merch tables, or people would be like, "Hey, can you like sell this on your table?" And everyone was really friendly and good about it, and it was super affordable. People just wanted to share, and that's another thing that has sort of extended to now with zine fairs is people are so stoked on what you're doing. People like,
Mhm.
I love, near the end of a zine fair when like the vendors themselves start walking around and they start doing the trading,
Yeah.
hey, I'm so and so, like, I was wondering if you accept trades or you want to do a trade. And I'm like, yeah, like, how else am I going to get all of these amazing zines? So, the culture of zines is just really positive. Um, because there is no right way and there is no wrong way to make a zine,
Mhm.
so there isn't this sort of hoity toity idea of like what it should be. So you're not sitting there being like, oh my God, that person just made a zine on 11 by 17. And I can't believe it's a folded zine and it's black and white when it should be, a 5.5 by 8.5, you
Well,
know,
well, you've
full
kind
color.
you, you've kind of answered my next question, because I was, like, is there a right way to make a zine? Is there not a right way to make a zine? And I'm just looking at yours, and the aesthetic is so interesting, and there's collage, and there's cutout, and there's artwork over on top and beside, and it really strikes me that, like, when you're reading one of these, you're in your hands. There's something that someone's hands have made, and that they've kind of thought about every choice that they put into it, and that there's a real I don't know, marriage between the aesthetic and kind of the message that's coming across in the zine.
That sounds so like sensual. Like, it's just the
Yeah.
zine. I'm reading the zine and just knowing that you at home were, you know,
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say.
Jenna Rose is just at home, like loving up all of her zines. You know, as for the design, like I feel like I'm a little bit like masochistic when it comes to what my idea is. Like, because back in the day, we used to do a lot of typewriter stuff and then like cut out things
Hmm.
bit by bit. And, you know, my zines have a lot of words in them. And I have had other zinesters be like, holy shit,
Right.
um, that's a lot. And, about halfway through each zine, I'm like, I'm an idiot, like why am I doing this? But the aesthetic is what I want. And that's, I don't know if I'll ever really make zines any other way without cutting them out. I don't know. I've in the newest one, I've definitely played around with different ways that the wording is cut out and placed. Um, so, but yeah, I love that they are tactile. I think it's really important. You know, I've said before that with Facebook and everything else, I'm a huge fan of Reddit, and it's so easy to just skip by things that make us uncomfortable. It's
Hmm.
also really easy for us to, identify as an ally by being like, oh yeah, I like this, share it, or I'm going to put, you know, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Black Lives Matter BLM in my like Instagram profile, and there I'm an ally, blah blah blah, and it's easy to do that. To scroll and just post and but I feel like with zines, you have to sit down and you have to, there's a weight to it. It's
Hmm.
there. You're seeing something. The pages. It. I think the experience is better. It causes us to pause, and if you can't just scroll through, and also you can't just be like, I'm going to share it and not read it. So
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, the zines themselves really, ask for us to pause and reflect on a whole bunch of things, and I want to talk about the Atrocity Against Indigenous Canadians, for Dummies series,
Mhm.
And you've said that it was created out of emotional exhaustion. And I'm wondering if you could just like talk a bit about how the series all began. What was it that prompted you, and how were zines the kind of right vehicle for you to kind of use for tackling these big issues?
Um, I think but to answer that question, I have to like lay a little bit of a groundwork in that I grew up in London. I grew up in Old South. Not really hard living there. My mother worked her ass off to provide for us, and I lived in a pretty privileged community, and so I grew up being like one of the only brown people in my public school at the time, but it was my community, so I didn't really notice anything different. And something, and I talk about this because I think other people have this. My family loves to get together and laugh, and the kids run free as long as they don't bother the adults. They're like, you can like entertain yourselves. You are a pack now. And the adults in the evening would like sit down with like tea or a pie or a glass of wine or something, and they would talk, you know, talk shop of their life. And we weren't allowed to be a part of that, but there was a point when we were. And I think a lot of people have that. When your parents are like, they don't maybe say it outright, but suddenly you start to realize like, okay, I'm at the adult table. And I had a really great childhood. Grew up on the powwow trail. Grew up with so much of my culture, which I'm very lucky for. Um, but when I started to hear like the adult stuff, it really, really shocked me. It was really difficult to hear. These idyllic times and places and spaces that I went to, my family did so well to like, you know, block a lot of the stuff. And yeah, I just had no idea. And it was just really heartbreaking. It was really hard for me to handle, you know. Like my mother like went to Indian day school and, got dragged up to the blackboard by her ear being pulled, and, things like that. And just these stories that broke my heart. And, you know, and then you start to see the prejudice and the racism and the oppression, and my brain just couldn't handle it, so I really distanced myself from my indigeneity for quite a while. And it was hard, and my mother and I used to like have debates about it. I'm like, I'm Jenna Rose first, and I'm an artist, and then I'm like indigenous maybe third or fourth. And my mother, in all of her infinite wisdom, was like, yeah, okay. So you know um so eventually I sort of like, I lived my life and stuff. I couldn't fathom that the community that I was making my life and doing art and everything else could potentially deny me things because of who I was, like because of being indigenous. And as I lived my life, I sort of started to tap in, like step back into things, and I started to realize like it's exactly the same. Like it's the same. Like I feel like I tapped out of, you know, a lot of the politics and the culture that was going on. And when I started like tuning back in, it was the same. And I mean, like, what? And also, I do have to note, like, what a fucking privileged thing to be able to do, right? To be like, I'm just gonna turn off this really shit oppression and work my hardest to like not feel it, not engage it, and but yet it's like daily all around me. So I was just exhausted that things are not changing and that we're not having the discussions. And the number of people that don't know about residential schools or 60s school, or missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, or just the fact that the communities just outside of London, their water is bunk.
Hmm.
So why aren't we having these conversations? So I just got to a point where I was like, well, what can we do? What can be done? How, like, what can I do? and I actually got the flu. And in my like flu sickness, I like kept thinking about like this project of zines. I wanted to do something that combined art and writing, and my brain just kept coming back to you can make a zine because I could self-publish it. I could
Mhm.
I could do that work and put it out. And so when I came out of my, NyQuil induced, haze, I was like zines, like, and I just went to town on it. And I was like, you know, this is as much for me as it is for other people. Um, but I'm tired of explaining to people, you know, and I'm tired of doing that labor. And so I just made them, and my plan was to be like, hey, you're a dick. Here you go. You need to read this, So if someone asked me like, "Oh, what's a residential school?" and I would be like, "No."
Right.
Um, and
Right.
hope that like it just also started a conversation, you know? Because it's the thing is like indigenous people, we don't want to talk about our traumas or our intergenerational trauma forever. We have other stories to tell, but sometimes it's like, let's get this out of the way so we can like tell other things too. We can do other stuff because we don't want to talk about it forever. It should be done. Like everyone should know. We shouldn't be in the um still teaching phase. Like it's 2021. It's time that folks know this.
I think I heard you say at a talk that you gave that, I don't want to talk about reconciliation right now. I want to talk about truth first.
Yeah.
And that, some of that's what this project is about. But I also like, it's very much in your voice and it's very like conversational. And I wonder if like there's something about that that breaks down the barriers a little bit and allows that just like it's like, hey, let's have a chat about this, and there is humor in these zines that take these zines tackle really, some of the deepest traumas and tragedies, but there's your voice and it's humorous and it's welcoming and it's kind of saying let's have a chat.
Mhm.
And I wonder like I wonder a little bit about humor. Like, do you is it just because you're funny? And you
Um,
because I mean I know you're funny because I'm funny, but uh, is it just because that's your voice, or is there a way that humor that you're thinking about humor and your tone when you're kind of like inviting people into having this conversation while being very, but I'm going to also set some ground rules here and we're going to define some terms.
I think it's a lot of that, um, you know, if I'd laugh, I'd cry. And I
Mhm.
think that, my mother would say, our humor is what gets us through it. And I think there's a lot of families, indigenous families, um, that, do the same thing and have the same traits. Like indigenous people, like, we're hilarious. Like and there's this ability to like there's some self-deprecating humor, the ability to laugh at ourselves because we have to, like, people talk about resilience, and it's like, yeah, a lot of that resilience is in humor and
Right.
looking at ourselves and how this has affected us, and our own healing work that we all have to do. Like no one is beyond doing the hard work to do better and to be better and live better, to be more than their traumas. And a lot of that comes with laughing, because sometimes some stories, like, you either have to laugh or you're going to be crying. And that's the same thing with the world. Like if you want to, you can be angry and sad all the time, because it's always, there is always something out there to do that. But um with the humor, it's definitely dark humor. And there
Mhm.
were times where I would write something and I was like, I don't know if anyone's going to think this is funny, you know? I just see that Summer wrote, "We are hilarious." Yeah, Summer is hilarious. She also knows. And like even Summer and I have chatted, like, when we're stressed out, something's happening, like, getting each other to giggle about it is the best, and I love you, Summer, I miss you. But, um, yeah, like, some of the things I know in the first, zine, it was I think I forget who I was with, but I was talking about these, like, short little facts, like, one was, about the boys that ran away and froze to death.
Mhm.
And it was just a small little thing, and I was like, just like little facts, quick fast facts, quick sad facts. And I was doing like this while I was talking about it, being like quick sad facts. And I thought it was really hilarious because they're always like wacky facts if you see something on TV or something. But the idea of something being, you know, wild, like, or visually beautiful, but then it just being like difficult and heartbreaking was sort of that juxtaposition that I wanted, you
Yeah,
know.
and I see it. I was going to ask you about that juxtaposition because in the first one, which is about residential schools, you include like survivors' testimonials, firsthand account, and they're of course they're profoundly sad and tragic. But the images that you choose to go along with them, like there's images of dolls and toys and they're playful, but they're also very warm, and they to me kind of like show these kinds of moments of kind of care of the words that they are set beside, and a
Mhm.
kind of like interaction between the kind of text and the stories, and the photos that, or not photos, sorry, the images that you've chosen. Was that just kind of intuitive as you were going, or were how were you thinking about marrying those two, these stories, and how they would look on the page?
A lot of the inspiration for, like, say, the first one about residential schools was, I have over the years collected like craft books where, it's generally geared towards young white kids, and they're often from like the 60s, 70s, 80s, and they're like, "Hey kids, it's a rainy day. Why don't you make a blackface mask?" And you're like, "Hey kid, it's a rainy day. Why don't you make an Indian headdress?" So it's just these like super racist, and it's funny because like some of these photos from these old you know, like stuff like these crafts, like make these Indian headdresses. Kids were in residential schools at that time.
Mhm.
Kids were getting their hair cut off and beaten and, assaulted. And they're just like, let's just make these crafts. Here, you can do this. You can pretend to be an Indian. You know, um, People of color oppressed all over in the 50s, 60s, 70s, yet craft books are being like, let's make a puppet show about, like people of color. And you're like, oh my goodness. So I've collected these over the years. So I just felt like, especially for the residential schools, because it was kids and we're
Mhm.
talking about youth, that, you know, I wanted to have this like sort of whimsical feeling, but then also be like, ooh, yeah, it's kind of horrible.
Right. So some whimsical images and some that are like deeply, deeply problematic.
Yeah, yeah, there's definitely ones like that. Like,
Yeah.
um, I mean, I often wonder like, what's this kid doing these days?
Mhm.
you know? Um, but I mean, like this photo is from something in the like 70s, but play TPs are a hot thing these days. This kid could be like now. So it's like, oh, how far have we really come, you know?
Well, definitely. I'm gonna your last one, which is the one on cultural appropriation. I want to get to that one. Before I do, there's a question from Cheryl. I'm not going to say last names. How do you distribute your zines?
Mm, I have an Etsy page that I use to for things to for people to purchase, and then you know people can either pick them up from my front porch or I ship out. So generally that, or when the land before the plague, we were able to do like zine fairs and meet up and hang out and that sort of stuff. So yeah, it can be accessed through my website, which we'll throw up after.
Yeah, I'm sure Josh is putting that in the chat. Um, Jenna Rose, would you read a bit from issue 2 on the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls?
Yeah. So yeah, you we had picked out a so in each one, I try to like lay out some facts and some experiences, but there's always a part where I definitely get really ranty. And I think the part you picked out to read is the one where I'm really ranty.
I love when you're ranty.
Okay. So throughout this project, the question, what do you want to come from out of all of this work, has been floating in my brain, and it is a question with an answer that is more fluid the deeper I go. There is an intense internal struggle within Indigenous communities about which direction do we take, what steps will be best, what do we want, and what do we need. I don't think there is a singular solution for how to fix the community or how to return the culture many have lost. When I was working on issue 1, I delved into ideas of what reconciliation really could be. And I found there to be similar questions because what does reconciliation even look like? It seems possible, but these questions overwhelm me because reconciliation looks like so many things and feels like so many things in my mind. I can't say that reconciliation can be achieved with a singular action or approach, but rather we need many actions and many approaches. The steps for Indigenous people to reconciling with the Government of Canada needs to not only be discussed when discussing residential schools, as it is only just one atrocity Indigenous people have endured. Indigenous communities need active steps towards reconciliation on all aspects of all issues pertaining to Indigenous pain, trauma, and affairs. When I was planning out this issue, I had sections for causes, current status, and how it connected to ideas of reconciliation in regards to residential schools, and I found that I cannot separate these topics as they are all woven together. What are the causes of hundreds, maybe thousands of Indigenous women going missing and being murdered, and the powers that be turning their backs? Well, it would be the same causes and ideas that made the powers that be think it was a damn good idea to steal children from their parents and place them in government/church run hellholes. It would be the same causes that gave the government the idea to take nearly 20,000 children away from their families and place them with non Indigenous families during the 50s through to the 80s. It would also be the same causes that let the government think it's perfectly suitable for many First Nations land to be without safe drinking water. It's the same causes that make the government think putting pipelines cutting straight through Indigenous land and water is a-okay. Indigenous people don't matter. Our concerns, our needs, our culture, and our lives do not matter. And therefore, why actually address these issues and listen to what Indigenous communities are saying they need? When hearing these things, most people immediately take the stance of, oh, well, it's not that bad. Or, well, that's ancient history. Or, well, I'm not a part of that, so why are you telling me about this? And my answers are as follows. 1, it has been that bad, and it is that bad. Indigenous lives being cut short and nothing being done about it is about as bad as it can be. And then you add on everything else, and your it's not bad is one big hunk of bad. 2, it's not ancient history. This answer drives me nuts because people have no idea, and y'all are walking around with this screwed up narrative of Indigenous people, and that narrative is usually that Indigenous people just can't get over it. We can't get over trauma if trauma is still occurring. 3, did you specifically commit any of these atrocities? Maybe not. But that doesn't mean you can't be an informed human who can do better by the Indigenous people who lived and thrived on this land before you. I was recently asked to participate in a discussion with some youth regarding Indigenous issues, and I was asked if I could think of a call to action for the youth. What it would be. A great group of kids, by the way. They had a brand new puppy too. I got to play with it. These are kids. I asked them to be informed, to read and know the history of the Indigenous people of the land they live on, and while reading, not to feel bad on a personal level. They didn't do this stuff to Indigenous folks. Many people, when hearing of the horrible atrocities committed against Indigenous people, immediately back up into a corner and get defensive. That's not what this is about. It's not about your guilt. If you didn't do shit, don't take on the shit as if you did, you know? What you can do is learn, change the language and the narrative where you can. Change your negative opinions surrounding the value of Indigenous lives and see where you, on a personal level and a community level, can create spaces where these atrocities are unacceptable and no longer tolerated. When the truth about Indigenous history and lived experience is no longer glossed over and kept out of history books and discussions, then we can say we're taking some real serious steps. I found myself thinking of the story of when the stories I tell, I and others tell, won't have to require giving a sad history lesson first in order for others to understand the history that is mixed into the blood that flows through our bodies. When will these stories be more commonly told from pen to paper rather than being spilled out onto the streets with violence? The women who have been murdered and those who remain missing were let down by various levels of power because their lives didn't matter to those systems of power. Women who were disenfranchised by a society that forgot them were ignored by the people who were supposed to protect them. These women were then further forgotten by the people who were supposed to seek justice for their lives being cut short. It's time we recognize that missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is a national crisis that has largely been ignored. We need to remember that these women had families, dreams, loves, and names.
Thanks, Jenna Rose. So, um, you had this idea to start this, to start this series, and um, you know, a lot of people have read these zines. You recently did a interview on the CBC. And I'm just want to ask, what has been the reception that you've gotten to your voice and these zines kind of being out there helping shape the conversation?
Um, Generally positive. I I don't know in the first um and I don't know if this has deterred any negative stuff, but in the first one I put um the creator of the zine fully expects a few people to feel inclined to write and give their awful opinion of how wrong the words in these pages are. Fair warning, should you feel inclined to do so, your word/name will become public and no regret of doing so will be felt by the creator or the participators of the scene. So I don't know if that's like, you know, made a few people not say anything. But generally everyone is very receptive. People do want to learn. And I think that's a positive thing is that overall people want to do better. People want to see people thrive. And I think it's a smaller number that that doesn't care. I think the number of people that do care and do want to see that change is greater than the number that don't care. um at least I have to believe that for my own sanity. And I think that people see that while we may be flawed, it's also important to really be teaching our youth these things. And like the youth are blowing me away with how rad they are. And they're having these tough conversations and navigating things that like adults have the hardest time doing. And, you know, uh, it's just, I have a lot of hope, especially when I see, the youth thriving and seeing what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that there's a big difference between. Well, I was reading Pam Palmater, kind of in I think it was the Globe and Mail article this week talking about kind of reconciliation is dead, right? And but she made a really critical distinction. She said, while governments have resisted reconciliation, Canadians have not. Canadians are far more informed about these human rights violations and are increasingly standing with Indigenous peoples as allies. Their collective demands for government accountability will only increase.
Mhm.
So, that kind of, is a hopeful message too. And it also says a lot about like the efforts that you've put, that you've put forward to kind of, again, shape the conversation and inform people and to, educate people. Have schools reached out? Have you, I mean, you talked about you were talking to some youth.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I I did a couple PD day sessions of the Thames Valley School Board talking about cultural appropriation within teaching. And, one thing that I really stressed is, and I think everyone can benefit from this is that we just live in such an amazing time of teaching. There, like, even when you're teaching your children stuff at home, like, the ability to teach authentic information is amazing. Your kids learning about, the Ukraine, you know what? You can go online and Google and you can get stories from, an elder in the Ukraine and tell something authentic. Same with indigenous people. Like, why, as a teacher who's non-indigenous, would you bumble through something and, continue misinformation when you can hop on YouTube and be like, you know, let's hear it from straight from people's, mouths. And, we have the ability to be really well informed. It's like people are like, how do I do this? How do I get more informed? We're all walking around with computers in our pocket, you know? It's
Mhm.
so easy to Google some information or be like, what book should I read to, or that's one thing about, the zines is the idea of like for dummies
Yeah,
because not that people are dummies, but
no, that's
like
what
the idea
attracted
is that it's
me.
just
That attracted me right
like,
away.
you're like, that's
Yeah,
speaking my name, speaking my language.
yeah.
But that it's like condensed, the Coles notes of some stuff. Like these aren't the end all be all of information,
Mhm.
and it's but it's a stepping stone, and it's pretty condensed. Um, and that's one thing I do want to say. These aren't the end all be all of things. Like there are so many nations and so much history and, so many different stories. And, you know, um, I'm lucky that I grew up with a lot and I grew up, with my mother and, my brothers are doing their thing too. Like my brothers are amazing. So, um, I'm just wanting to start a conversation.
And you say that in your zines a lot, and you also pack them full of like links and to further information. And so it's kind of like you get your voice and you get what you have to say, and then you're always saying, "But read more, do more,
Yeah.
think about this," and you point people to different places. Coming back to this one, this is the most recent one, the one
Yeah.
on appropriation. Yeah, it struck me like so at the very beginning of this one, you kind of talk about, let's talk about the word appropriation. You kind of talk about how it has become, so charged and so hard to kind of talk about. And in the first kind of couple of pages, you almost say like, let's, just step back a second. Let's like, take, let's, you know, let's step back a bit, and let's kind of turn down the heat in the room, and let's kind of talk about what this word is.
Hmm.
And I'm not gonna. This is not about saying this act is racist. This act is not racist. That's not what this zine is about. And you say like, let's just talk, and then you kind of go over some examples. And that's not to say that you don't have some hard no goes for some
Hmm.
cultural appropriation practices, but it's more of a kind of a conversation where again you ask people to kind of, you say, if you will listen, I will tell you some stuff, and then I want you to reflect on some stuff
Hmm.
before you go about doing this. And again, it's not that kind of I'm going to lay down the law. I'm going to ask you to think and reflect, which as an educator, I think that's really interesting to me and an interesting way. I'm so used to, we're kind of so used to kind of like standing at the front of the room and kind of laying down, like, this is what you need to know. And, before I get you to read from this, I just wondered, like, who taught you how to teach? I mean, I'm just interested in
Um,
like where you came to the, yeah, your approach, because it's so rigorous, but it seems to me so open and generous.
um, the people in my lives, like, um, my mother and my family, having those conversations, going back to what I said about, indigenous families doing that work. Um, I've seen my family do that work, and I've also had to do that work. So having those conversations of talking through, you know, the less flattering points of ourselves, um, and wanting to do better and be healthier and be emotionally more healthy. Just seeing people navigate that. Learning by example, I guess, is one thing. My entire family does a lot of, reflection, and we have a lot of really great conversations. And, you know, I'm like any other sibling, like I can annoy the piss out of my brothers and vice versa. So, having to navigate that to be a better sibling and to be, a better uncle or aunt or daughter so I guess I take that same sort of approach with the zines. Like, let's have a talk. I like to always assume first before anything miscommunications and, maybe people not having the right knowledge before I dive into, calling people out. And we're definitely in a call out culture, but I don't think that it immediately needs to be in anger. So I try and do the same when talking about things like cultural appropriation and that, like, hey, that's not cool, but I'm not going to be like, "Ah," So, um, yeah, I think just by example, seeing other
Well,
people. Yeah.
the I'm not, this book I really highly recommend. To people and to educators. I'm going to use chunks of it for sure. Um, and you go through, various practices, and you kind of talk about each one. And I'm not gonna, I'm gonna tell people, get your hands on this, and then ask you to read a little bit. I think a chunk from the end, because
Uh,
we're
my
kind of.
ranty section again.
I don't know if it's just the awesome section.
Okay, right now, ready?
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay, so I think, yeah, it was titled "Back to the Big Deal." Okay, another aspect many don't seem to realize is that in the course of Canadian history, the Canadian government and pretty much every denomination of organized religion sought to stamp out every element of our culture. The aspects of our culture that you, as a non Indigenous person, seek to have a piece of is only known/slash remembered with thanks to the many Indigenous people of the past who defied violent efforts to delete who we are. In good old 1885, the racist powers that be decided that allowing the Indians to practice their ways was getting in the way of their efforts to civilize us. A Canada wide ban went into effect prohibiting Indigenous people from practicing their ceremonies and cultural ways. Potlatches, sundances, and any gathering similar, such as powwows, was strictly prohibited. This ban would exist nearly 75 years until 1952, when the idea of human rights entered into the public lexicon. Aw, human rights. Despite the ban being lifted, it wasn't until the 1970s when Indigenous people began to have enough collective knowledge that we were able to begin practicing our own ways. And also, just to note, like, that's like, there's like bits and pieces. Like, we don't have a whole picture. We're often like going to other nations at times and asking. Nearly 75 years. That's an entire generation or two that was not allowed to grow up understanding and living the ways of their people. You combine this band of our ways with the horrors of residential schools, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the 60s scoop, and many other atrocities, And you start to see why many Indigenous people are struggling to understand the way we were. So let's go back to what's the big deal. The big deal is that it's a massive deal that the practices and teachings that were ripped from entire communities should never be cheap fodder to increase social media likes or a way to make your living space trendy. Many people, Indigenous people, the people I am from, have died fighting to preserve our culture in order to pass it on to our children. There are entire nations that exist that don't care if you feel you're engaging in smudging as an act of reconciliation. What? Many nations are on their own journey of healing their traumas, all while trying to relearn traditional ways, ways that are our right to hold and our right to demand they not be cheapened by consumerism. I recently had someone ask me about the use of marketing, the idea of find your tribe, hashtag something, in reference to something that had nothing to do with Indigenous people. I asked her why she would easily use the ideas slash terms slash practices of Indigenous people and not another culture. She didn't really have an answer, and I feel this is an important element of this entire conversation. In Canada, Indigenous people have always been viewed as Canada's Indigenous people. The idea that this country saved us, owns us, cares for us, civilized us, and protects us from our own savage ways has always existed. The thing is, we never asked for it. All of this was forcibly done against our will and is still happening. We are not children, and Canada and the Crown are not our parents. And shout out to the rad Indigenous spoken word artist, Jessica Hayes, for this amazing analogy. She has a really amazing spoken word poem, and I think she's rad. We never consented to being owned, and we sure as hell aren't Canada's Indigenous people any more than others are Canada's POCs or Canada's white folks. Borders are social constructs that are defined, policed, and controlled by folks that are not of this land. And so to come and say that they own the original stewards of this land is just wackadoo. Indigenous ways of living, connecting to the land and our mother, our grandmother, the moon, our brother, the sun, the way we celebrate the moments in our life are indeed beautiful. I get why people desire such beauty, but just because you were raised thinking Canada owns slash save slash protects Indigenous people doesn't mean that you get a piece of the pie just by being Canadian. Being Indigenous is so much more than the color of your skin, where you were raised, and the blood that flows through your body. Our indigeneity is comprised from the stories evoked by words of our languages, the memories in our bones that tell us what needs to happen, the beauty of learning from family how to make bannock by feel. Our indigeneity is felt in the way our bodies feel at home when we dance and sing, when we pick our medicines and give our thanks to the spirits. Being Indigenous is when my daughter sings and talks to the thunderbirds when it storms, and it's the way that my Cree name draws me to the rocks. Being Indigenous is not knowing the ways of our people because of assimilation and colonization, but feeling in your bones that the land and water call you home to tell you all the stories to soothe your heart. Existing as an Indigenous person and the sheer act of living and relearning our traditional ways is a radical act of protest, and this is our real reclamation. It's a heartbreaking and tough journey to try to gather as much teachings as we can, but when we see our braided babes using our language and dancing the steps of our people, we know it is a radical act we cannot stop. Being Indigenous is so much more than buying commercially raised sage and abalone shells, play teepees, and big box store moccasins. When someone points these things out, rather than get your back up, stop and question how much you know about the sheer struggle that went into preserving this knowledge and how the hell it ended up being hawked for profit to the masses. Stop participating and continuing the cycle of profiting off Indigenous people's trauma and loss.
Amazing. Amazing. Thanks, Jenna Rose. Um, I'm gonna kind of leave the last words with you. Those last words. If there are any questions, we've got a little bit of time for questions. And maybe while people are debating whether they want to throw a question in there, I will just take this time to talk about what's happening next week and how the second part of this zine talk and shop. So Words Fest every year since it started 6 years ago has made an instant zine over the course of the weekend. And we put out a call, for that zine, and it that follows the theme of the Words Fest that year. So the theme for this year of our zine is possible utopias, and I think Josh is putting that call, or has put that call, in the chat. We made the zine, but we are reopening it, and we are reopening it to everybody to submit pieces of work. And you don't have to come back to the workshop next Thursday, but I'll be here, same time, same place, where you can kind of share your works. And I just want to show you some of the zines that we have made. I think Josh has put the cover art by Ben O'Neill for the ones this year, but these are the ones that we did, that we've done. London artist Deanna Tamblin, Sean Kaiser, Jason McLean. You might have heard of Jenna Rose Sands.
Look at that one. Oh, that one's
This
so
was last year's when we did, when Words Fest was, one of its themes was food. So have a look at that call, and if you've maybe got some work that's already ready to go that takes up some of the themes of possible utopias. I won't read the call out to you. It's quite a long call, and it's basically designed to be open enough for any works that kind of consider the future utopian or dystopian. And so please do think about joining me next week and sharing your work. We're at 8 o'clock right now. I do see one question, Jenna Rose, that about whether zinesters have the right to cut out pieces from existing publications and including them in other publications.
Well, I don't know really any zinesters that have ever had a problem. That's why I stick to really old stuff, just in case.
Right, and yeah. I mean, that kind of being the part of it being an underground and, you know, agricultural, and, you know, using the materials around you as you wish to, and not, you know, abiding by those rules of, you know, proper publication, seems to me.
There is a question in the chat, and it's from Caroline. Hi, Caroline. I know you. She's just asking about open to sharing your thoughts on Indigenous land acknowledgements. Would I consider doing a zine on it? It's definitely something. I potentially would do a mini zine on it. My thoughts are sort of similar to the word about cultural appropriation, you know, being a bit of a buzzword. And I do think that it is in danger of becoming really a checklist item. People just like read the same things out. And one thing I do have to give like super huge props to you, Tom. I've heard you read a couple land acknowledgements, and I don't think anyone has been the same. And I think that's really important. Like, you're really, you know, putting some thought, and I definitely appreciate every time you do one. Because I have seen multiple people read them, and it's just the exact same. And it's definitely been a checklist point. And the same as I've said with like the calls to action, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's, you know, they're stepping stones, and you don't get like a gold star. You don't get a check mark for doing it. It's like, you can say it, but if you're not really thinking about it and doing some work and learning, and you're just saying it so you don't get blasted on social media, then it's worthless. And I do say that you can tell when people are just doing it for a check mark. And, you know, at that point, I would rather not hear it, you know? So yeah, I definitely heard some where I'm like, what's the point? Like, you just, you know, you made it worse. You made the situation worse. So yeah.
Great question. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't monitoring the chat, so I haven't been seeing any of the questions that have come. So I'm glad you got that one. That's a great one, perhaps to end on, unless you saw any more.
Yeah, one just came in. I was wondering if your zines could also be considered a form of self-published journalism, given their educational impact. Um, why not? you know, yeah, yeah. I mean, that I think it definitely can. Like,
It seems to me that like zines can be memoir, journalism,
mhm.
comics, creative nonfiction. Like it doesn't seem like there's that there, it's a big, um, it's a genre that can hold many genres.
Yeah, it's also like, who who decides like who can tell a story or report on something, or um I don't consider myself a storyteller, like indigenous story. I feel like, to for myself, a storyteller in our community, like I don't have the life experience yet. I don't, I it's such a like coveted place. But you know you don't need to have a degree in something to be able to have an opinion and talk about it, or to research it or write it. And you know what? You may not be an expert in one thing, but you are an expert in your own story, in your own journey. And that's one thing that's really nice about zines, is people are able to publish, self-publish or whatever, and communicate with people about their own stories and perspectives. And you don't need to go to a publisher for that. Because sometimes with academia, we really think that we don't have a place in some places when we do. You know, you may not have gone to school for writing or, art, but that's not to say that you can't do either. You know, th- School is not the gatekeeping of your experiences and doing something different and new in your life. If you've ever wanted to write, just start writing. It's not to say that you don't have to wait for someone to be like, you're a journalist, you're a writer, or did you go to school? So that's something I like about the DIY aspect, is it's taking a bit of, that personal power away from colonialistic institutions, So I like the being seeing people take that back. Like, you know what? I want to write a book. I'm gonna write a book. I'm just gonna write, and whatever. That's so
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, there's one last question here. I see, like, how do you reference your work? I'm not sure if that means like in academic, like in papers, or but I would think you can look that up, whether you're MLA, APA, Chicago style. I'm guessing that that's what that question is. Yeah, I'm sure that information is
Mhm.
Googleable.
Googleable.
Um,
Get on the Google.
I want to thank everyone who came tonight, who was out there. This is, these are strange and very challenging times, and I think everyone's feeling a lot of Zoom exhaustion. And but having a night like this and having everyone out there and sharing in the chat is really a nice way to feel some community, feel some connection in a time that I don't know about you, but I'm in need of that connection. So I thank everyone for coming. I
Mhm.
really thank the Right Place at King's University College for sponsoring this talk, and Josh Lombier and Words Fest for making this happen. Do come back next week with some work if you want to. And I just want to end finally by thanking Jenna Rose Sands for coming and answering our questions, my questions, and sharing, her work and her words and her thoughts and her wisdom and her artwork. And do check out her website and get your hands on these, because they are wonderful. And so, Jenna Rose, thank you so much,
Thank you, everyone.
everyone. And it's so nice to see everyone. Well, we didn't get to see you, but it's so nice to be with you all. And I'll say good night.